Welcome to Woodturning 301. This is going to be fun. It's going to be a lot like the last classes, but it's also going to be somewhat different because we're dealing with wood from the urban forest. By that I mean trees that have come down and are being turned green. The turning processes will be very similar, but one of the things that is different is we've added an extra step. And that is appropriate for allowing the wood to dry and then being remounted on the lathe a second time for a second turning. And I'll show you all those steps. But in this video, I want to talk about finding that wood, a little bit about the wood, get it on the lathe and do a rough exterior. In the next video, we'll complete the piece. What I have here in front of me is a piece of tree, just a branch. Out of that, I need to make a bowl blank. And one of the things I need to do is be able to identify where is the best way to cut it. Obviously, we're going to cut this log to some length. Typically, I cut them about 20% longer than they are around. Purpose of which is to allow a little bit of trimming on either end if there's some splitting due to rapid drying at the very end. But then that piece has to be cut into a half log or a bowl blank like this. The question is, where in this piece of wood do I make that cut? Well, if we look straight down on this thing, first thing we'll identify, and I hope the growth rings on this show up fairly well, but the pith definitely does. This is the center of the tree, believe it or not. So the tree has grown at such an angle with such wind pressure and gravity and so on that cause this not to grow perfectly straight. And that's like most trees. So if I cut this, I can end up with a bowl blank any way I want. But if I cut it, let's say, right here, I'm going to have a portion of the tree with very close growth rings here and much more broad growth rings over here. So as it dries, it's going to deform and twist. It's also not balanced in terms of perspective. This is fairly round and this is a different curve over here. So what I typically do is to take and lay a ruler on the blank or a yardstick through the pith, and I rotate it around until I find what looks like a good balance. Well, obviously I just showed you this isn't, but maybe someplace, well, this is fat here and this is a different slope. It's pretty hard to find where I'm going to get a good blank out of this piece of wood. I may end up finding that I have on this side a very nicely balanced blank. On this side, I may have something I really can't use, or I can't use as a whole half. But here I'm looking, the shape is somewhat uniform. The growth ring spacing here and here look somewhat alike. So I might make my initial cut right there using this half. And perhaps in this piece over here, I may have to make an additional cut. I may not get much out of it. So I've got one big blank and one small blank. That's the way trees grow. They don't have much options most times. So here's the blank I'm actually going to use. It has already been shaped like that. We found where the center is, and I've drilled my hole to allow me to use my screw chuck. And I've taken a compass and drawn a rough outside shape. And I'm going to go to the bandsaw in a couple of minutes and just cut these corners off, simply to save us a little bit of banging around at the lathe. But there's something else I want to tell you about this wood first. And I'm going to go to the bandsaw and maybe just cut a little wedge out of here. And I want to talk to you about wood movement. Let me make a quick cut, come right back. What I wanted to do. I want to cut the little wedge here because I want to talk about how wood moves. I brought along my sample tree. This is soda straws. Somewhat indicative of the way grain in wood looks. Similar like this. The tracheids, or the tubes of wood, if we want to call them that, are like soda straws, and they're oriented in this particular direction. So, on the average, every tree moves differently, but on the average, wood moves in 3 different directions. Number 1, this direction. And I'm going to call that roughly 0%. It also moves this direction. And of its diameter, in the process of drying, it moves, on the average, about 4% of that diameter. It also moves in this plane, this way. And in this plane, it moves about half of that, or 2%. And as I said before, longitudinally, for all practical purposes, 0. So that means how we cut the blank and how we mount the blank is going to have a big impact on how the wood is going to move as it continues to dry. Well, as these cells dry, the water that's contained inside these cells begins to get slung out. That's the stuff that hits our face when we're turning green wood initially. That's just free water. But in the cells of these tracheids is also contained water which has to evaporate much more slowly. But as it evaporates, these soda straws shrink in diameter. So as they shrink, the wood moves. I know you've all seen a piece of wood along the roadside where it has been cracked down one side. That's the wood moving in this direction and finding a point where it has to finally relieve the tension, and it splits someplace in order to allow it to continue to move and dry. So when we take a blank, it's like this piece of bay laurel, and make a bowl out of this, I know that in this plane, the wood is going to move much less than in this particular plane here. So I'm going to get some deforming, misshaping of the wood. So in green wood turning, we do a 2-stage turn. We rough turn it, which is what I'm going to do in a few minutes. And we leave the walls relatively thick, the purpose of which is to allow the wood to move as it chooses. And then we go back to the lathe at some future point in time. Sometimes it's months after the wood has dried and these cells have shrunk to its ambient condition. Ambient's not the word I want. It's stable condition. Then we put it back on the lathe and correct all the misshaping that happened as a process of drying. Well, we're going to start off with the screw chuck, as I showed you a minute ago. But when we make the tenon for this piece, instead of making one that just exactly fits, I'm going to make one that's larger, maybe even a little bit larger than this, because one of the other parts that shrinks and misshapens is the tenon. So I'm going to turn this piece of wood, allowing additional removal of wood on the tenon during the second stage also. So I may make it about that size. So I have already taken the blank I'm going to use, which is a piece of bay laurel. I'm going to go to the bandsaw again and trim these corners off. Because this piece is large enough, I was able to take a small slice off the back side, which gives me a flat and a nice place for the tailstock live center to set in, and also gives me the opportunity to lay this flat on the bandsaw and trim these corners. So let's go to the bandsaw, make the trim, and then get over to the lathe and start making not chips, but strings of wood this time. Okay, bandsaw first. My tool rest is set at 45. I'm at 45. The rotation of the tool is 45. We're right back to the normal starting position. Speed is at the 0 spot. We'll bring it up slowly. We're way out of balance. We'll come in a minute. There's a little vibration of the lathe, so I'm going to back it off just a little bit below that. Safety glasses. Face shield. Here we go. Okay, already I'm going to have to stop and move the tool rest in. That clearance was well over an inch as I trimmed these corners back. So we're still going to continue to bring the cut from here around this direction here. Back to work. And I'm going to go from pulling to pushing. Okay, so we're coming down, we got a flat. Now, looking at these flats, they're about equal size, which means the blank has been fairly well centered. The amount of bark on each side is, fairly well centered, but we'll come out with a nice shape here. So I'm going to bring that cut again from the bottom up. Remember, we're not coming in like this because that is catching these end grain fibers and we don't want to do that. Okay, here we go, one more cut. Pretty close, pretty close. first beauties of turning green wood is getting these kind of things instead of chips and sawdust. So we've got the piece rounded up fairly well. The bottom needs to come in, and we need to create our bowl shape. I'm going to bring this down for my tenon first, which means I need to flatten this off and reduce it down in the proper diameter. So let me pull this tailstock back, and I'm going to remove this because it has always been a problem for me. I have a tendency to run into this with my elbow. There we go. So now we're going to just flatten off the back as we've done before. These cuts are all the same as you've already seen. So there's nothing new here other than the feel of working with green wood. The weight is higher, of course, because of the water. And this is not smell-o-vision, but I'm working with bay laurel, and it's very aromatic, very nice wood. There's my tenon. At least that's the location of the tenon. So let's, while we're still here, might as well finish that off. The difficulty is that I'm using a skew chisel, which has a different profile, so I'm going to have to readjust the tool rest. I'll remove my tailstock to get it out of the way. And we're going to bring the tool rest up so that this comes right through the center. Yeah, pretty good. And it's a different skew, but it's all going to be pretty much the same. So straight down to give the straight shoulder, then bring it around flat to give the flat face on which the jaws will eventually rest. Okay. Now back to our bowl. This is all about shape now. I have to stop. I have to move my feet. I need another stance. Okay, we have a rough shape. We have a bark inclusion here that may pop out, or not. Maybe a feature or not. Here you can begin to see the growthlings pretty well. Here's the pith someplace up here. And this bowl is centered pretty doggone well around the pith. That means it's been cut reasonably well. Now, I don't need to finish it off. I am going to do a little shaping right down here at the foot just for a second. And then we're going to go to the next stage. I like little feet on bowls. Okay, so we have a tenon, we have a rough shape, and you know, in terms of putting any more work into it, at this point it's unnecessary because all this will get returned later at another date, many months down the road. So we're going to take this off of the screw chuck here. Take out the screw chuck. Remount the blank. Now there's also a mark been put right here. I'll need that later for realigning in the next stage of this. So I'm going to open up the chuck jaws, and you see how much wider I have them? Because I know I'm going to have to reduce the diameter of that tenon in the next stage. Okay, in and tight. Good enough. So first thing we need to do here is face this off. Goal is just to get that relatively flat. Now, here's something that's different. We're not going to turn it to final wall thickness. This bowl is about this big around. I need to keep approximately 1 inch. There is my final diameter. The reason being, I need to allow room for this wood to move, have enough material left for me to come back in the next turning to bring it back into a round. I don't know how much this is going to warp. I do know the wood, and I do have some sense of it, but not knowing that, I want to allow generally around 1 inch to 3/4 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make my bowl in here, keeping this wall thickness as uniform as I can down through and including the base area down here. I want it to dry uniformly. If it's thin here and thick here, this will dry rapidly, this will dry slowly. The difficulty then is we risk the possibility of some cracking due to that. Okay, little bowl making now. Heard a little thumping. That's the start of that piece of wood coming through. Now, I'm going to work down just the 1st inch, like I did before, trying to match the outside curve here as best I can. Get that out of the way. I was running into it with my tool. So I'm going to come here, work out, down until I get to that area. my mark. Well, let's see how we're doing. It's getting a little thicker at the base. That almost always happens for me, so it'll get caught on the next pass. So I'm going to take some more off. Just moving that little piece in the center, and you know the reason is I didn't have my hand in a place that would allow the tool to go through the center. As a result, I probably went over by letting my hand drop. Then I had to come back and clean it up. So let's take a little bit more off. Let's check that with the calipers. Use a different set this time. And as I can see from the end of the calipers here, that's fairly uniform coming down around to here. So when we get down to the bottom and turn, you see it's getting bigger. And I'm going to go to my bowl scraper to finish that off. And we know we have to be a little higher on our tool rest. Well, that's plenty high. That'll work. See how we're doing. It's getting thicker right there. Clearance is about 1/8 to the 1/16. Come down to right about there. Clearance went away, so I need more removed in that area. So let's go to a different scraper, just for the fun of it. Now we can get back down inside here. Yeah, now it's different here because the base is turning in, and that's okay. So what we have is a roughed out bowl, which is all that we're going to be able to do during this phase of the turning. There's one more step with this bowl, and I'm going to seal all this surface, especially this end grain area, to allow the wood to dry more slowly. And I'm going to use a emulsified wax solution. It's an aqueous base, so if I get it on my clothes I can wash it off. And then I'm also going to write down here the date and the species of the wood. This is Bay Laurel, and I write the date down here also. So see you back over at the bench where I get out the sealer and the markers. Okay. 6, 20, 20. Labeled. And a gallon of, this brand is called Anchor Seal, but it's as good as any others. And I'm just going to use a regular good brush, and if I don't wait too long to wash my brush out, this is completely rinsable. Now the side is not so important, but these end grain areas right here, specifically, this area right in here, really important to get that done. Side grain is not going to hurt it, so it's just easier to do the whole thing. Here's that end grain. Ends of those soda straws are going to bleed out the moisture much more rapidly than the sides of the soda straws. So what we want to do is seal that as best we possibly can. I'm going to seal the tenon also while I'm at it. Just doing it all, why not? And definitely the inside, same thing. And I'm just going to let it sit here on the bench for a couple hours. This will dry. And after it's dry, what I'm going to do is put it in a brown paper bag, which will allow the moisture to evaporate more slowly. And we'll have a piece ready for the second turning in a few months. So, greenwood turning, phase 1, rough it out, allow it to dry, and we'll come back in the next video and do phase 2, which will be completing this project. Well, it won't be the same bowl, but it'll be the same idea. So I'll see you in the next video where we complete the project.